Vault 13, Intake Register 22-317. The item before me is a composite file reconstructed from three sources: a damp field journal recovered from an abandoned monitoring shack designated Station Theta, a cassette tape with handwritten label ENV Theta 1998, and a partial export from a data logger with a failing CMOS battery. The shack stood on the northern edge of a decommissioned research tract, spruce and tamarack, standing water even in dry months, a power line corridor running out toward nothing. The coordinates, as left on an index card inside the journal's pocket, have since been painted over on the card in white correction fluid. The covering is careful, layered, and old. The journal paper is splayed from moisture, but the handwriting is consistent. Block letters, deliberate, the kind of neatness that either comforts the writer or dares the future to misread them. Several pages have graphite rubbings of tree bark and a culvert tag. There are notes toward the back about battery inventories. AAX16, DX4, 9, VX3. Bring more. And a grocery list that never became groceries. In the margins, a penciled phone number with no area code, then crossed out. A page is torn where it would have shown the station's map. The cassette tape is low bias, cheap, its clear shell fogged at the corners. Someone has scored the leader with a thumbnail. Splices are present, two that I can see through the shell, another revealed only when the reel bound mid-transfer. The tape has been recorded over at least once. A faint music bed under some of the voice captures suggests a prior life as something domestic. The voice that overlays it, when the recorder is turned toward the subject and not at the wail of the wind, belongs to a single speaker for most of its length, with a second person present only as the negative space of response. A pause that expects an answer, a rustle that accepts one. The data logger export is ordinary in its way. CSV headings for temperature, barometric pressure, soil moisture. Two microphones labeled North and Sioux MP, and a field called Delta T correction that should be a calculated column but is not. Timestamps wobble. There are gaps shaped like decisions. All three sources were boxed together without accession numbers, sealed with duct tape, and left in the vestibule outside Vault 13 sometime between late autumn and early thaw. Whoever brought them waited long enough to be sure the building still listened, then did not come inside. The vestibule camera for that period recorded only the violent grain of snow beating the lens. The bulb there has been burned out for years. I have catalogued stranger things. The unease here is not in what is said, but in what holds steady around it. The station's notes show patience. The instruments are calibrated. The voice is tired, but not dramatic. Nothing in the first pages asks to be believed. The case file, if I allowed myself such language, would be routine. A study of water and wind in a place built to be quiet. And yet the tape's splices return at intervals like a breath the recorder tries to regulate. The CSV's Delta T grows a degree of freedom it should not have. The journal's margins fill with small arrows that begin to point nowhere. For the record, I have reconstructed the sequence as faithfully as possible, placing the written entries and audio extracts against the sensor readings where their timestamps agree, or else where they disagree in a way that becomes itself a kind of agreement. Standard cautions apply. Vocables and inaudible passages are marked. I have removed the grocery list and the phone number. They belong to someone's living life, not to what followed. We will begin with the first week of observations from Station Theta, as kept by the lead technician. The voice you will hear in the interludes is theirs. If you listen for anything beyond that, you may hear it. I advise against listening for a pattern. The Archivist, Vault 13. The technician who kept the records of Station Theta arrived in early April of 1998 at the end of a thaw that never quite took. The site was meant to be temporary, a small environmental monitoring outpost built to measure soil temperature, barometric pressure, and sound pressure levels in the peat marshes of the northern corridor. Nothing unusual. The government had a habit of placing these shacks far from view and even farther from curiosity. According to the logbook, the technician, whose name was never recovered, was methodical. Every note is clear, measured, unemotional. They arrived alone, repaired the generator, calibrated their instruments, and began collecting baseline readings. The data was ordinary for the first 12 hours. Then a gap appeared. A column in the data logger labeled Delta T, a field meant to calculate timing corrections, began returning blank values, seconds missing between samples. The technician assumed firmware corruption and reset the device, but the gaps returned, widening slightly each time the logger was restarted. At first, it was a glitch. Later, it began to look like time itself had started to slip out of sequence. On the tape, the technician's voice is calm. They mention a kind of silence in the air. A null, they called it. Between gusts of wind, there were moments when all ambient sound seemed to fold in on itself, as if something in the atmosphere were pulling against the air. The recordings confirm it. Long, heavy stretches of static, punctuated by short, rhythmic pulses too low for the human ear to hear. In the following days, those pulses grew stronger. They matched the rhythm of something underground, like a mechanical pump running far below the marsh, but with a resonance more biological than industrial. The technician described the sensation of it through their boots, a tremor that wasn't vibration but presence. They began to hear tapping at night, measured, deliberate, and patient. It started beneath the floorboards and sometimes shifted to the sump trench outside. Each time they tapped back, the sound would stop, wait, then return, slightly out of sync, as if thinking. By the fifth night, the technician noticed changes in the ground itself. Depressions spreading eastward from the trench, softening soil that should have been frozen solid. The moisture readings spiked without any rainfall, and the temperature just beneath the surface rose to nearly 11 degrees Celsius, while the air outside stayed below freezing. Whatever was beneath the station was generating heat. In their last calm entry, the technician wrote that they'd struck metal just 14 inches below the surface. A circular shape, smooth and resonant. When tapped, it didn't ring. It resonated through the soil like a struck bell that never stopped vibrating. The temperature around it was warmer still. They decided to cover the hole and reassess in daylight. But that night, they recorded something unusual. Faint light leaking through the disturbed soil, like a glow that faded when looked at directly. The technician assumed phosphorescent fungus or chemical reaction from iron oxidation. The data, however, recorded a localized increase in ambient light without any corresponding change in temperature. Over the next 24 hours, the station's generator began to fail. Coolant boiled out. The trench widened. The tapping became louder, echoing through the sump walls like knuckles on hollow metal. At precisely 3:17 that morning, all logging devices froze simultaneously. Every clock, even the mechanical one on the desk, stopped for 6 seconds before resuming. When data resumed, the technician noted that the sound, the deep hum from below, had changed. It no longer pulsed from the ground, it pulsed from within the shack. They played back the previous night's recording and found something layered beneath the hum. A voice, faint and distorted. The first recognizable phrase was, "below the sump." Later, when played backward, another phrase appeared, "open ground." It was around this point that the technician stopped sending reports to Field Office North. The office later confirmed that one of their nearby stations, Station Lambda, experienced a system-wide freeze at the exact same timestamp, 3:17. Their sensors failed. Their staff evacuated. Back at Theta, the technicians' logs grew fragmented. They wrote of heat rising through the floor, of moisture condensing in the air, though the heater had been off for days. The metal beneath the soil was radiating warmth despite permafrost conditions. Soil samples returned a pH far too acidic for that region, almost corrosive. When handled, they left a faint metallic scent on the skin. On the final tape, the technician's voice is strained but steady. They describe hearing the hum match their own heartbeat, speeding or slowing with their pulse. They said the sound was beginning to anticipate their breathing. There is a pause in the recording, followed by a single sentence. It's responding to observation. After that, only a final note. They would suspend recordings until contact was re-established. That contact never came. When recovery crews reached the site months later, they found the shack collapsed inward, the soil beneath it sunk into a shallow bowl of frozen mud. The trench was gone, and with it, the sump. Of the technician, nothing remained. The metal object was no longer visible, but magnetometers registered a distortion underground extending outward in a perfect radius, 1 kilometer across. Every recovered clock from the site, digital and mechanical, was frozen at the same moment, 3:17. None could be restarted. The events at Station Theta would later be filed as a case of equipment malfunction caused by geothermal instability. But in the recovered CSV data, the delta T field, the one that once measured time drift, resolves perfectly to 0 at the end, as if whatever caused the distortion didn't break time at all. It corrected it. That was the last known record from Station Theta. The descent, I think, began the moment the technician mistook steadiness for safety. The second set of materials from Station Theta, the ones found scorched near the foundation, cover roughly 4 days. The technician's handwriting becomes erratic, as though written while moving. There are fewer measurements now, fewer references to calibration or barometric readings. The voice on the cassette tapes grows softer too, distant from the microphone. Something in the station's rhythm had changed. By April 14th, the hum had become constant. Not loud, just inescapable. The kind of tone that doesn't exist in the air but in the body, the way you feel pressure before a thunderstorm or the vibration of machinery from deep underground. The technician described it as the sound of a room listening. They noted that even when the generator was turned off, the light fixtures in the ceiling continued to glow faintly. Not white, but a dull orange. The power draw was impossible to measure. Every instrument read 0 amperage. The light simply existed, independent of current. They began sleeping in short bursts, waking often to the tapping beneath the floor. By then, the pattern had evolved, no longer random or rhythmic, but ordered, almost conversational. A sequence of 7 knocks, pause, then 3. Always the same, always originating from below the metal plate they'd found. At one point, the technician attempted to drown out the noise by running a portable radio at full volume. It worked for several minutes until the signal cut to static, and through it came a faint echo of the same knocking. 7. Pause. 3. The radio continued transmitting the pattern even after its batteries were removed. It was around this time the soil around the station began to subside. The wooden stilts supporting the shack sank by several inches, tilting the floorboards. Water seeped up through the cracks, though the surrounding marsh was still frozen solid. In the sound recordings, you can hear the faint creak of timber and the slow trickle of water beneath speech. The technician's final coherent notes suggest that they believed the plate was not a buried structure but a barrier, something containing pressure from below. They wrote that the warmth radiating through the soil wasn't dissipating into the air. It was cycling back downward, as though the ground were absorbing the heat and returning it to its source. At 3:17 on April 15th, the data logger captured its last complete reading before final failure. The temperature beneath the surface registered 57 degrees Celsius. The device's internal clock froze. The technician's wristwatch, recovered later, stopped at the same moment. On the tapes, there's a sound. A sudden rush, like a deep intake of breath through the microphone, and then silence lasting nearly a full minute. When the voice returns, it's unsteady but clear. It's hollow underneath, the technician says. There's air moving down there. The metal isn't covering anything, it's floating. They repeat the word floating several times as if testing it. The sound of a spade striking metal follows, then a series of dull impacts and scraping. And then, faintly, a new sound. Not the hum, not the tapping, but a low resonance that climbs in pitch until it merges with the microphone's feedback. After that, the entries become scattered. Sentences break off mid-word. Several pages are stained dark, not by moisture, but by something that etched into the paper itself. Thin rings of burned cellulose radiating outward in circles, the same pattern later found on the shack's foundation posts. At some point during those final days, the technician began leaving the recorder running constantly. The last 40 minutes of audio capture only footsteps, heavy breathing, and occasional fragments of speech. They talk about light under the floor, about seeing reflections move when I stand still. The voice grows hoarse, then distant, as though moving outside. Recovery teams found the tape melted and fused to the player's capstan. Most of it is unreadable, but a section near the end survived. I've listened to it many times. It begins with the door opening, the sound of cold air rushing in, and a few quiet steps crunching over ice. Then the hum, stronger than before, resonating through the microphone as though the entire landscape were vibrating at once. The technician whispers something, one word repeated twice. It might be hollow, it might be follow. The two words sound nearly identical in the static. Then abruptly the voice says, "It's open." The rest is distortion. When the recovery team arrived months later, the soil beneath the shack had collapsed into a shallow crater, roughly 2 meters deep. In the center of the depression was a perfectly circular imprint of fused sand and clay, an impression where the metal plate had once been. But no plate was found. Beneath that point, core sampling revealed a cavity extending downward for at least 50 meters, filled not with air or water, but with a fine, glass-like material that interfered with radio signals. Geologists described it as vitrified soil, earth melted from below by intense, prolonged heat. Yet, there was no evidence of combustion, no burn line, no thermal gradient. Whatever caused it had acted instantaneously. The most unsettling part of the recovery came later, when technicians examined the surviving data logger. The device was in perfect working order, its battery uncorroded, circuits intact. But when powered on, the internal clock displayed a date 22 years in the future. It had kept counting somehow after the station was gone. It should not have been possible. The data logger's internal chip was incapable of tracking time without power, but the clock had not merely drifted. It had progressed, consistently, accurately, second by second. The recovered CSV file contained only a single entry, one row of data with all fields blank except for delta T, which read simply 0.000. The handwriting on the last surviving page of the technician's journal is fragmented, the words scorched and incomplete. Only one line remains legible, not under the ground anymore. After that, nothing. The case file was sealed by the Department of Environmental Assessment under the classification non-replicable geothermal event. No further expeditions were sent to the site. Satellite imaging of the area in later years showed that the ground continued to subside, forming a slow, circular depression now over 200 meters wide. Locals who live near the old power line corridor still report faint humming on cold nights, too low to hear directly but strong enough to rattle window panes. It comes and goes without warning. In winter, when the snow crust hardens and the air is perfectly still, the sound travels farther, following the line of the buried cables that once fed the station. Several of those cables have been found stripped of insulation, fused together like veins of metal glass. The ground around them feels slightly warm, even at sub-zero temperatures. Every clock recovered from the area, mechanical, digital, or atomic, has one irregularity in common. At least once per day, they lose precisely 6 seconds at 3:17, then resume as if nothing occurred. Some technicians say the missing seconds are merely a calibration fault, a leftover data artifact from the old logging equipment. Others believe it's an echo of whatever happened beneath that station, repeating itself quietly across every circuit it touched. I've examined many anomalies in my years here, but this one carries a strange stillness. It doesn't escalate, doesn't spread, doesn't scream for attention. It simply waits. Every device recovered from the region eventually resets its time to zero drift. Delta T equals 0, just as it did on the final day at Theta. A perfect correction, a still point in the machinery of time. And when I listen to that surviving tape, when I play those last few seconds, even now, the sound that comes through isn't just static. It's a pulse, faint but steady, repeating every 6.2 seconds. The same interval noted in the first week of data collection. The same rhythm that began it all. Perhaps the station didn't collapse. Perhaps it synchronized. For nearly a decade after the disappearance of Station Theta, the file sat dormant. Officially, the case had been closed. The shack was gone, the site written off as a landslide. But here, in Vault 13, such files have a way of returning to the surface. In 2008, a digital restoration project was underway, an effort to consolidate old magnetic data from decommissioned research stations before the tapes decayed beyond recovery. Among the hundreds of transfers sent for cataloging, one appeared without a sender's name. The metadata listed its origin simply as Field Archive Theta. It contained no audio, no images, only a single data log, one that matched the serial number of the data logger recovered from the ruins. The file header placed its creation date exactly 10 years after the collapse, down to the minute. And within it was new information. The log's timestamp began at the moment the original equipment had stopped recording, 3:17 in the morning, April 15th, 1998. But rather than being frozen, the new data continued onward, registering steady readings for another 8 hours. Temperature, pressure, soil conductivity, all perfectly stable. The missing seconds, the time drift, the irregular intervals, all had vanished. The system had synchronized itself. What unsettled the technicians reviewing the data was not what they found, but what they did not. There was no sign of any station hardware still active in that area. The transmitter that sent the file no longer existed. Power lines to the site had been torn down years before. Something else had sent the log. The department's analysts suggested an ordinary explanation. Perhaps an unsynchronized server somewhere in the network, finally coming back online and pushing stored data. But that did not explain the readings. The data did not describe an environmental system at all. The columns once reserved for temperature, pressure, and soil moisture now contained words. Short fragments rendered in binary code, later decoded as simple English text. Some of the phrases matched lines from the technician's recovered journal. Open ground, listening air, pressure equalized. Others were new. The first new entry read, observation acknowledged. The next, time stabilized. And finally, at the 8th hour, a third, we are not under. Those 3 phrases were repeated over and over again, perfectly formatted, as though the data logger itself had been repurposed for something other than measurement. The message was signed with a checksum that resolved to a single word, Theta. After this event, the department initiated a quiet re-examination of several older files, cases with unexplained data drift or corrupted instrumentation. A pattern began to appear. Every incident had occurred in remote locations once used for atmospheric monitoring. Everyone reported minor soil subsidence, a low-frequency hum, and short, localized temperature spikes. And in each, the instruments stopped recording at 3:17 in the morning, only to resume again days, months, or years later with data that no longer represented measurable phenomena. Some of those later files contained text fragments like thetas. Others contained images, strings of pixels that, when reconstructed, formed blurry, repeating shapes resembling cross-sections of concentric rings or ripples in water. When analysts overlaid them, the ripples aligned. Not perfectly, but closely enough to suggest a shared origin point far beneath the surface. It was at that stage the department's attention shifted from research to containment. For a time, they attempted to bury the phenomenon, both figuratively and literally. New soil was brought in to cover the area around Theta's site, and fresh power lines were run in a different direction to prevent magnetic interference. But within months, the soil began to sink again. Geophones buried along the perimeter registered faint harmonic oscillations every 62 minutes, the same interval the technician had recorded before the collapse. One analyst noted that the frequency of those oscillations matched a minor natural resonance of the planet itself, one known to geologists as the Schumann frequency. But the amplitude, the strength, was far higher than it should have been, as if amplified by something hollow beneath the crust. The department made several excavation attempts, but each time equipment failed within 50 meters of the surface. Cameras went dark, sensors froze, and clocks drifted by the same missing 6 seconds before resetting. The deeper they went, the stronger the drift became. Eventually, the project was abandoned. The official reasons cited cost overruns and safety risks. The unofficial one was simple. They no longer wanted to know what was below. Yet, not long after, the event began to echo elsewhere. A forestry outpost 200 miles away reported identical subsidence and electrical interference. A survey team in the Rockies recorded the same infrasonic hum. Even a monitoring buoy off the eastern coast transmitted the same 62-minute pulse before losing contact. It became clear that whatever had begun at Theta was not confined to the marsh. The data continued to surface in scattered fragments, binary patterns, repeating pulses, brief surges of electromagnetic static, most of it meaningless, until someone realized that when those pulses were converted into timing signals and stacked sequentially, they formed the shape of a waveform. Not random noise, but a pattern of repetition, like speech. The analysts who worked on it called it the voice of the Earth. That name never made it into any official report, but it circulated quietly among the staff who had listened to it through headphones, hours of subsonic rhythm that sometimes rose just high enough to brush the edge of audibility. They said it didn't sound mechanical or natural, it sounded like breathing. In the years that followed, a few independent researchers tried to study the phenomenon outside government oversight. One of them, a physicist from Manitoba, published a short paper suggesting the possibility of a global resonance network, a system of cavities and tunnels under the crust that might act as a single harmonic oscillator. The paper was dismissed as speculative pseudoscience. The author disappeared 2 months later. His laboratory equipment, later recovered, showed the same 6-second clock irregularity noted in the Theta case. As for the field where the station once stood, it no longer appears on satellite maps. The ground there is still subsiding, slowly but without end. In winter, when the snow hardens, you can see faint circular patterns radiating outward from the depression, as if something beneath the surface were breathing shallowly beneath a layer of glass. The latest data we have comes not from an instrument, but from a recording made by a drone surveyor passing overhead last year. For 41 seconds, its microphones picked up a tone, barely within human hearing, followed by a single pulse of silence. When that audio was analyzed, the waveform revealed a repeating pattern in its noise floor, a series of evenly spaced depressions that correspond to a simple binary phrase. The translation is imperfect, but it matches the sequence from the 2008 file. Observation acknowledged. Time stabilized. We are not under. The difference is that this time the phrase was not sent from beneath the ground. It came from the air, transmitted on a radio frequency used by modern weather satellites. Someone or something had moved the signal upward. What that means I cannot say with certainty. But there is a growing suspicion here in the vault that the phenomenon at Theta was never confined to one place. Perhaps it was not a discovery at all, but an awakening. There are theories, none official, none safe to write down in public reports. One suggests that the planet itself functions as a kind of resonant shell, a recording medium stretched across eons. Under certain conditions, precise temperature, pressure, magnetic alignment, it begins to play back what was stored there. Not just sound, but memory. The sum of everything that has ever pressed upon it. Footsteps, voices, machines, storms. And when those patterns align, the Earth remembers not only what has happened, but what is yet to come. If that is true, then perhaps the technician at Theta did not uncover something buried. Perhaps they simply stood in the one place where the recording was still playing. The department's final directive regarding the site, issued quietly in 2012, was simple. Do not re-establish observation. And yet, the act of writing that down is, itself, observation. We are told not to listen, not to measure, not to record. But the silence left in the wake of that command has weight to it, a kind of listening of its own. Every time a microphone hums without cause, every time a clock hesitates at 3:17, I wonder if we are all being calibrated to the same invisible signal. When I played back the last segment of Theta's recovered data, those binary phrases that replaced the sensor readings, I noticed something small but persistent. Between the lines of text hidden in the data headers, there was a field that had not been part of any known file format. It was labeled correction offset. Its value changed each time the log was accessed, and after every access, the clock in the transfer terminal would lose 6 seconds. Not once, not twice, every time. Here in Vault 13, our systems are isolated from outside networks. They should be safe from interference. Yet last week, while preparing this file for cataloging, I heard something through the speaker of the terminal, a low hum, rising and falling in cycles of roughly 1 minute. The waveform, when captured and magnified, matched the theta pulse exactly. Perhaps it followed the data here, or perhaps it has always been here, waiting for someone to remember it. Observation acknowledged. Time stabilized. We are not under, no one knows what that final line means. I suspect it is not reassurance, but a warning. If they are not under anymore, then they are somewhere else. And if that is true, then somewhere above us, perhaps in the air, perhaps within the invisible radio that ties our instruments together, something is still listening. Something that learned long ago how to correct for time. The file from Station Theta is now sealed. Not destroyed, not erased, just locked away, like the others that refuse to end. Each time I handle one of these cases, I am reminded of how fragile our boundaries really are. The world we think of as solid, measurable, obedient to clocks and calendars, it shifts under inspection, time drifts in the cracks, and something always waits inside those missing seconds. Theta was not the first instance of temporal correction, but it remains the most complete. The data, the recordings, the way it all converged on that moment at 3:17, it feels deliberate, almost architectural. I have listened to the final pulse hundreds of times, trying to decide whether it is mechanical or alive. I no longer think there is a difference. Machines record what we build into them. They echo our will. But when something older, something buried beneath the order of things, learns to echo back, that is when the distinction collapses. The technicians who analyzed the Theta log believed they were studying a failure. In truth, they were witnessing adaptation. The instruments did not malfunction. They evolved to accommodate a signal the human body cannot perceive. The readings aligned, the drift resolved, and for an instant, perhaps less than a breath, every clock agreed on a single moment. Perfect synchronization. That is the part that troubles me most, because synchronization implies intent, something wanted to be seen clearly, even if only once. When I replay that data stream through our isolation servers, it still produces the same harmonic pattern, though faint now, like a residual hum in the equipment racks. The engineers assure me it is only interference from the building's electrical grid, but I have switched off the grid. The sound remains. It grows stronger at night when the vault settles and the air becomes still, a low vibration that gathers along the walls, subtle enough that it might be mistaken for memory. I sometimes wonder whether it is the building remembering Theta, or Theta remembering us. Several of the younger archivists refuse to work near this file. They claim their wristwatches lose time after handling the drives. Others report hearing a slow, rhythmic knocking when the vault lights are off. 7 knocks, then 3. I have heard it only once, but that is enough. There is a theory among those of us who have handled multiple resonance cases that each recovered artifact, each corrupted tape or field journal or logbook is not an isolated incident, but a continuation of the same event. A conversation stretched thin across decades, waiting for a listener patient enough to hear it through the static. If that is true, then every act of recovery we perform here only furthers that conversation. We are the new instruments, recording and replaying a signal we cannot fully translate. I sometimes think about the technician who stood alone at Theta, listening to the hum beneath their feet. They measured it, cataloged it, tried to fit it into columns and units. But at the end, when the instruments began to align, they must have realized that what they were hearing was not the Earth itself, but its echo. That echo reached us. I keep their final words in my notes. It's responding to observation. That sentence feels like a confession, or a warning, perhaps both. Vault 13 exists to preserve evidence of what should not be forgotten. But the longer I do this work, the more I suspect that forgetting might be the only protection we ever had. Still, I will keep the record. I will mark the tape, transcribe the fragments, and store the data under cold light and silence. The hum will fade eventually. It always does. Until the next arrival. Each new file carries that same pulse somewhere inside it, a pattern of missing seconds, a breath held in data. And when it reaches 317, everything pauses, just long enough to remember what silence used to mean. This concludes Case File Theta. Observation acknowledged. Time stabilized. We are not under. The record ends here. For now, the Archivist, Vault 13.